Good to see everyone. I'm Jen Kaifesh, the owner and founder of Great Expectations. I see a lot of familiar names on this webinar, so nice to see you again from other webinars. So I will also try not to repeat too much that's in other webinars and keep this a little bit more specific, but there is some overlap, so just bear with me if there's things that you've heard before or we'll hear again later in the coming weeks. So the other thing, just so everyone knows going into this, so everyone could put kind of grades and questions they wanted to answer. Tonight is actually an even balance between freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. So just telling you that because my advice for freshmen might be slightly different than my advice for seniors. So I'll try to clarify some of that. And then also we had some people kind of mention their GPAs and what schools would be a good fit. And we had kids who were, a 2.7 up to a 4.7. So I'm going to try to kind of speak in broad terms. So bear with me because I can't nail everything for everyone, but I'm going to try my best. Okay, so I want to just use go over these terms first, because I think this is something that everyone hears. And these are terms that give people a little anxiety with what people mean by these. And by the way, there are other terms. I know some people will try to find, like, safety and likely I'll differentiate, but some people prefer the term likely because safety implies sure thing. But everyone uses slightly different terms. But let's just go through the basics of what these mean when people reference them. And when I reference them for the rest of today, this is what I mean. So safety or likely. So when you say a school is a safety school, by the way, there's really very few schools in the country that are a safety school for everyone, right? It depends on, everything's relative in this entire process. So a safety or a likely is a school where you are above average in terms of GPA and test scores. And by the way, obviously, if you're applying to a test blind school, or you're not submitting test scores, that part's less relevant. But use this just kind of to give you a sense of things. So an example here is if you have a 4.0 and a 1400 on the SAT, and you're applying to school where the average GPA is a 3.4 for incoming freshmen and a 1210, it's going to fall into the safety or likely category because you are significantly above average for what they're usually accepting. The difference, again, everybody's terms are different. I sometimes differentiate between safety and likely. Safety to me is like the world is upside down if you don't get in, that statistically they accept a ton of people. The odds are very low that you're going to get rejected because you're so above average. A likely is a school where it's like, I'd be surprised if you didn't get in, but it's not impossible, right? It's not necessarily such a shock. Targets, it's where you are, what they accept, right? Whatever their average is. So if you're that 1400 and 4.0, they generally accept kids with a 4.0 and a 1400, right? That's a target. Target is a school where you are kind of average for what they accept, and that's a good thing. But let's talk about reaches. By the way, when we work with students, I add a category called super reach. And we'll talk about why. But a school where you are below average in terms of GPA or test scores, but here's the kicker, or one that has an exceptionally low acceptance rate. So if you are applying somewhere that, you can be applying to a generally not very competitive school, but if you have a much, much lower GPA, it's still a reach for you, right? So if you are below average for what they generally accept, the part in parentheses, the exceptionally low acceptance rate, is the part to be super aware of. And this is why we call it a super reach sometimes. If you're applying, Stanford was 3.95% acceptance rate this past year. And I've seen families who are like, but my kid has a 4.3 and is top 10% of their class, or even valedictorian or whatever, then it should be, a target because he's average. He has the GPA and test scores that Stanford wants. And I said, well, if you think of everybody who's applying to Stanford, like, he's maybe average, maybe above average, maybe below average, but when you're only taking 3.95% of kids that are exceptional, it's its own league. So just be aware that every once in a while I'll refer to super reaches, and that's that category of school that is just, the numbers are kind of not in your favor. An example I always like to give is if you think of, we'll just use Stanford. So Stanford has America has 30,000 high schools, give or take, right? Including public and private. So if you think of only valedictorians applying, and only the valedictorian from each school applied to Stanford, no one else, that would still be a 7% acceptance rate, right? So when you're thinking about this type of thing, or even when you look at how many kids get perfect SAT or ACT scores, it's still a fraction of those kids. And not to say clearly you don't need those things. You don't need to be valedictorian or need to have perfect scores. but just understanding how much, of a super reach some of these schools really are. Okay, so when we talk about safety, target reach, super reach sort of schools, these are some things that you need to decide first. So when you're building your list, these are questions you need to be asking yourself. If your students on this call, you also need to be asking your parents. If your parents, you want to talk to your students. But one of the questions, first thing in this day and age with all the test optional, test blind, testing required variations in schools, is do you have scores or will you have scores that you'll want to send? So if you're an amazing student and a terrible test taker, you have to be aware that there are schools that are back to test required. So for instance, Georgetown and MIT, some schools in Georgia and Florida also. But those two are big ones where it's like I have kids who have 4.6s and have taken a million APs, are incredible students, but those schools flat out require testing. So that would clearly change your list. Same thing if you are not a great student, but the best thing about your application is your testing, which I've seen kids who had a really rough start to high school, GPA is not that great, they didn't really challenge themselves that much, but they were really good testers, and that test score is really going to help them. Be aware if you're applying to test blind schools like the UCs or the Cal States or Pitts or USD, some of these other schools, Caltech even now, any of these schools that are test blind, that can hurt you because that is potentially the best part of your application. So everybody, this varies whether it helps you or hurts you, whether they're test optional, test blind, test required. This is something we talk about in a lot of the webinars, but to mention that the test optional, the phrase test optional doesn't mean like if you want to, it means if it can help you. So remember that if you're a decent tester and whether or not you do prep, whether you take it on your own, if you can get a score, however much effort you have to put in on your own or elsewhere to get a great score, it will help you at schools that accept scores. So don't feel, unless you know you're only applying to UCs and Cal States, that's something that can change what's the safety target reach, right? So just keep test scores in the back of your mind. We'll talk a little bit more about those later, but that can greatly change things. And there are schools that care more about test scores and some that care less. Now, are you better suited for a college or a university? So this is something a lot of people don't understand the difference. And the reality is there's also schools like Boston College that kind of throw things off with the terminology, but colleges have no graduate school in theory, right? If you think of even Georgetown University, Georgetown College is the school within, or Harvard College, right? There's other ones that you have school, but Amherst College, right? You think of liberal arts colleges. There's not graduate students on campus necessarily, or maybe there's a few, depends on it. But the idea is that the focus is on undergraduate education, right? A university is usually more of a research institution that they have graduate students. So they have people pursuing masters, PhDs, JDs, MBAs, whatever. And a lot of the professors' focus is going to be there. But as an undergrad, you're going to have a lot of opportunities to take part in that. So this oftentimes comes down to learning style. So if you want smaller classes, colleges are generally a lot smaller. So you're gonna have smaller classes, closer relationship with your professors. You see this stuff in movies sometimes, but it actually is quite true. There are a lot of little liberal arts colleges that you get to know your professors and you're going to the house for dinner. You're having tea or coffee with them and you get to know their family. It's a very close-knit community at a lot of colleges. The other thing about applying to these is, look, if it's a competitive college, it's still going to be incredibly difficult to get in, but colleges are more in tune with a student's entire narrative, right? And they care because they're such a small community. They want the kids who really bring a lot to the table, who are good members of the community. So maybe you had a blip on your transcript that another bigger school might just say that, we can't accept that. They will look for kind of context with what's going on with you. Universities oftentimes kind of have general numbers that they're looking for and know that they want to fall into that. And it can be a little bit more of a numbers game at universities. Now, there's huge exceptions to that. So to be clear, that's just kind of a broader statement. But you want to know, like, if you are STEM, right? So if you want to pursue engineering, you want to be pre-med, if you want to be doing research or anything like that, or anything technology based, you might prefer a university because you're going to have more opportunities there generally. Where colleges are not necessarily huge research institutions and immensely technology based. So if you look at smaller schools, you'll notice like some of them don't even have engineering as a major, and some that do, it's very limited and very specific. So something worth keeping in mind, but we'll also talk a little bit about, when you're applying to these schools, knowing what they're looking for might tell you if something that is an equally competitive school, but is the safety is a college or a university, you might bring more to the table for one than the other. So for instance, if you've done a ton of research and you can write all these essays on why, a university that does a lot of research might value that more. Okay, limitations that are financial. Everyone's different. The main thing I always say is do your research, don't make assumptions. So these are two headlines that have come out in the last month. So Rice University to cover tuition for students from families earning less than $130,000. Then Princeton, not to be outdone, about a week ago, just came out with Princeton University to cover tuition, room and board for students from families earning less than $100,000. So they're covering everything. This will also likely drive their acceptance rate down and make them even more competitive because people are going to want this opportunity. But I bring this up because I hear a lot of people say that they're not going to apply to private schools because they're more expensive. And so I want you recognizing that private schools also have large endowments. They have people donating a lot of money. They have whether it's donors, whether it's there's merit aid, there's need-based, there's a lot of things that, I think hopefully some of you are already in that webinar last week. But recognizing that if you are applying to state schools, this is more of a numbers game. Private schools are more likely to say, but we really, really want you. We really, really like you. And how do we kind of throw money at you to make things happen from a merit side, or in this case, need side, right? Princeton just says, if you make less than this, we're going to cover everything. So don't eliminate things because of cost within reason. There might be some exceptions, obviously, but the reality is there was a school in New York City, is like 6 years ago, that every accepted student got $80,000 because they had an endowment for scholarships that was expiring. They were supposed to use it by a certain date, hadn't been used appropriately, gave it away. Next year, no scholarships, no merit scholarships. So you don't always know what's happening behind the scenes. So if there's financial limitations to your search, I just want you being aware that if you don't look at the sticker price, it's not like, car shopping, or even that's negotiable, but I want you thinking of it more as like, let's apply, see what we get, right? And see how this works out. One thing that's worth kind of keeping in mind when you talk about merit money, a lot of the top schools don't offer merit money. If you're talking top 10, even top 25 schools, there's a lot of those that don't offer merit scholarships because they consider the merit is having been accepted. That's their gift to you, is letting you in. They don't feel like they need to throw money at you to convince you to come. So some just flat out do not do it. Others have a few scholarships, right? So if you look at certain schools, look at Vanderbilt, look at some of these, and you can just Google Vanderbilt scholarships, and they'll say, here are the different scholarships. There's, a few of them. You can apply to specific ones. So there are some schools like that, others that, like I said, just don't have any. And so that is something to keep in mind for merit. But back to the safety, target, reach categories, reach schools will almost never give you merit money. Like I was just saying, like most of those top schools feel like their gift to you is letting you in. If you are thinking of this from the capacity of like, I have families all the time saying, well, we would go out of state if he got a bunch of money and it was a great school. So the reality is it's probably one or the other to a certain extent from the merit standpoint, because if they're thinking of just trying to wine and dine you, right? They're looking at this kid as overqualified. That's why they're throwing money at the kid and saying, we really want this kid to come and kind of make us look better and have a higher GPA, higher test scores, more impressive resume in our incoming class. So that's who they give money to. So don't eliminate things because you never know with a lot of things, but there are definitely more likely merit scholarships coming from safeties than targets or reaches. All right, so consider out-of-state schools, same thing. It's just kind of more about the financial element. This is something where I hear people all the time say, now there's schools like University of Michigan, amazing school, love it. They don't give much money to out-of-staters. They don't really need to. But again, if you have schools that are maybe slightly less competitive, but still, perfectly lovely schools, Oregon and Boulder give a ton of money, right? So even though they're out-of-state state schools, they still will throw money at kids to get them there. Again, Michigan merit scholarships for out-of-staters, I don't know if they don't do it or if they just haven't done it in a long, long time. But most of their, like the vast majority of their merit money, if not all of it, goes to in-state kids. This is something else. This is this takes a lot of research to understand it well, but I wanted to just throw it out there. So again, if the financial limitations are in play, which by the way, for most people it is, given the cost of higher education at this point, WUI, it's the Western Undergraduate Exchange, used to be University Exchange, now it's Undergraduate Exchange. The idea of this is that if you are in certain Western states, there's a tuition exchange program. So if you're a Californian applying to Colorado State, you, instead of paying out-of-state tuition, pay 50% more than in-state tuition, which is way less than out-of-state tuition. So it's not quite getting in-state tuition, but it's honestly quite close compared to what out-of-state is. Here's why I'm saying it takes more research. So if you Google WUI or WUI college list, WUE, you will get the list of colleges and you can explore this. The challenge is that only certain majors at certain campuses are eligible for this. So I've had students who picked colleges on the WUI list because they wanted this tuition exchange program, but then it turned out that you had to be an English major or you had to be a philosophy major or whatever it was. So just do that research. But again, this is something worth keeping in mind. Okay, geographic limitations to your search. So as you're trying to build your list, my big, and look, everybody's different and there are perfectly very strong reasons for a lot of people to stay close to home. I understand that. But we hear a lot of people say, well, I want to stay in Los Angeles or I want to stay in Southern California. And the reality is there's great schools in Los Angeles and Southern California. There's also a lot of really great schools that are outside of it. So trying to encourage, broaden your horizons. I would say you can pick a school in Los Angeles at the end of senior year in April when it's time to decide, but don't necessarily decide now not to apply to schools outside of your preferred area. Also recognize that there are places where you as a Southern Californian might actually be desirable where they don't have many of you. So I always, I say this half jokingly, but it's actually very serious, which is if you think of, Minnesota, so whether it's the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities, or you think of Carleton College or Grinnell College, which are small liberal arts colleges, but very highly ranked, really good schools. They don't get too many Californians applying to the middle of Iowa or Minnesota, and they're wonderful. They will love to have Californians apply. So you might be checking a box from a geographic diversity standpoint that you never expected. Plenty of kids apply from Southern California to whether it's Texas or New York or Chicago or Michigan, but there's certain areas that if you realize you don't have too many friends applying to these schools, that actually may help you, not just because of competition, but because they are looking for kids who are going to be geographic diversity. So again, sometimes branching out a little bit of where you think you want. And I always like to point out it's 4 years. I know in some ways 4 years is a long time, but it's also short. It's a chance to try something new. I have a lot of kids who say they want to be in or near a city. I respect that. I went to Northwestern. That was part of my choice, is I wanted to have access to a city. I took advantage of it. But there's also the school of thought that when else are you going to live in a small town in New Hampshire, right? Or upstate New York in a rural Pennsylvania little town, like all these places, you're probably never going to live otherwise. So why not try it now? It's a different experience. And, all of you Californians who can't deal when the temperature drops below 60, learn how the rest of the people live. Go try it, have seasons, right? Be open to this. And again, you can choose to go somewhere in California that has wonderful weather and you can surf and do all the things, but just be open. You will have more options and possibly better options down the line if you are more open-minded about geography. All right, so these are just some things as you're building your list to also be thinking about: size, setting, special programs. We talk about size, just small, medium, large, meaning like we kind of talked about colleges and universities, but even universities, there's a huge range. You have some that are going to be, some universities are small as like 3,000 people. Others are going to be, state schools are generally universities, obviously, and then those are going to be 30, 40, even 50,000, depending on where you're looking. So there's a huge range of universities. But also private schools, public schools, you'll be shocked at how big some private schools can get and how small certain public schools can be and state schools. So understanding what you mean by this. So a perfect example to me, I've heard people say that they didn't like a certain school because it was too small. And that can mean very different things, because it can mean the campus, right? So think of, let's talk about Los Angeles. If you think of Occidental. So Occidental College is in Eagle Rock. It's a very urban school. It's in Eagle Rock, right? There's not sprawling campuses, but it's very bustling because it's a lot of kids in kind of a tight community or in a small, compact area. So it has maybe more energy, but a pretty small campus compared to other schools. So say you go out to the Claremont colleges, which admittedly is also 5 schools on a single campus, but even so, it's sprawling, right? It has all this space, big green quads, but it's more spaced out. So it can also feel a little sleepier. So when you're talking about size, I want you to just make sure you're paying attention to what you mean by that. Because when kids tell me too small, is it the number of kids? Is it how big the campus feels? How many opportunities there are? And when you talk about too large, is it the size of the classes? Is it the overwhelming, you're going to be a number feel? Or is it that you don't want to have to take a bus from one side of campus to the other? So these are, again, things that generally kids will have a certain preference, but your list doesn't need to all be the same size or the same type of school, colleges, universities, state schools, private schools. You can have obviously a range of this, but make sure you're paying attention to what really matters to you. Now, when we talk about the setting, one of the most common things I hear, which I kind of alluded to earlier, is the desire to be in or near a city. And this is one that I push back on a lot, because define city. And usually when I talk to a kid about what do you mean by a city, they're like, I want to go to coffee shops, maybe be able to go to a movie theater, go shopping. Like, guess what? You can do that in a tiny college town. Like that is fine. There's restaurants, there's things like that. Ann Arbor in Michigan is a perfect example. It's a small college town, but it's an awesome college town. And also there's great food there. So you've got, if I have kids who are, self-described foodies, I was like, you're going to have awesome food. You have a limited number of restaurants for 4 years, true, but they're great. And yes, you can go into Detroit if you want. You probably won't find better food necessarily there, but you have options. So understanding what you mean, because now if you're saying I need to go to the symphony and go to art galleries and professional sporting events, not college sporting events, there are reasons you might need a city, like a Boston, a New York, a Chicago, things like that. But the vast majority of kids, when you get down to it and boil down what they mean by a city, you're going to be fine with a college town, or even being an hour outside of a big city where you have a beautiful campus, things are nice and quiet and peaceful and, a little enclosed and self-contained, but then you can hop a shuttle or hop a train or hop whatever and go in and have dinner or go in for the weekend or whatever it is. So just don't let that determine too much of your search when you're doing this without really thinking through what you mean by that. Then rural, honestly, the opposite, same thing. I have plenty of kids who say they don't need a city. And then I really challenge them to think about what they mean by, when they say they don't need a city, what are they going to do on campus? If you're in a rural setting, what is that going to look like? So the special programs, this is meant to be more academic, obviously, but sometimes I have kids who are like, I want to be on a debate team and I need a school that has this style of debate. So yes, that's going to limit your list a lot. Or if you need equestrian, or you need like certain, extracurriculars, but it could also be, I want to do biomedical engineering, or I want to do, pick anything, creative writing. There are certain schools that are going to be better at certain majors. But again, I always challenge this being too much of a limiting factor, because what happens is I see kids who say, so perfect example is business majors. So I see kids all the time saying, I need a school with a business major. Fine, if you want to study business, that's not the issue. The issue is that there are a lot of great schools that don't have a technical business major, but set you up and have, like, if you look at the schools that are like the strongest feeders, like Harvard Business School, if you're applying to HBS, you're applying to Stanford, any of these schools, they pull from a lot of places that don't even have a business major, because a trend, just as a side note on this, there is a trend that a lot of MBA programs are not necessarily looking for undergraduate business kids because they all look the same. They want kids with areas of expertise. So I bring this up because I went to Northwestern, and Northwestern does not have a business major. They intentionally dropped it because they felt it was too jack of all trades. They wanted the kids to be more specialized in skills. Fine, good or bad, there's great business here. You don't need it. You can have it. But when kids eliminate it, I was like, but do you know how many kids they place at the top, whether, it's investment banking firms, consulting firms, like anything, it's incredible, but they don't have that business major. So I always say certain things, you maybe need the specialization. If you want to be an architect, you need an architecture program, right? But business is especially, more than anything else, one of those that don't eliminate schools. Michigan's another example. So Michigan has the Ross School of Business, which is incredibly competitive to apply to. Great program. But they also have a major called organizational studies, which you can Google it afterwards. It's amazing, but it's like a great jumping off point. And if you look at the rate of employment, before graduation, it's incredibly high from them organizational studies major. These kids come out with very niche, very interesting skill sets that differentiate them. So anyways, so special programs, again, don't let it determine too much of your list. Yes, make sure you have what you want, but realize there's oftentimes different paths to the same end result and end goal. You want to find a school that you're going to be challenged at, but that you can still thrive at and do really well. That's the most important thing. So when you are trying to find these schools, these are some of your research, or this is some of your resources. So you guys have Naviance. If you are a junior or a senior, seniors, you definitely have access to Naviance. Juniors, you might get it second semester, but the College Center might kill me, but I think you can request the login, or maybe it's second semester. But that is a great resource. What it basically is it shows kids who've been accepted from Pally or rejected from Pally. So you can see with a certain GPA and test score, how have kids fared at a certain university, and the data is specific to Pally, which is nice because you can look at national, but it doesn't really tell you the relationship with your high school. Now, if you look at you can Google University of Michigan freshman profile, like the freshman class, or another one is like class profile. So you could do Dartmouth class profile. This can be great. It gives you a sense of who they're admitting, but there's also on those pages a lot more information, and it'll tell you, gender breakdown. It'll tell you how many kids are on financial aid. It'll tell you how many sometimes it'll tell you how many legacies, how many national merit scholars, right? All of this stuff. There's going to be a lot of information. One of the big ones that, especially for those of you who are looking for very competitive schools, that I recommend you look for when you're looking at the class profile, the incoming class profile at any university, is what they are, close to my train of thought. What they are, what they're looking for when it comes to class rank. So if you are, and Pally doesn't rank directly, but you can get a sense of where you are compared to your classmates. So for instance, and this is off the top of my head, so don't quote me, but I'm pretty sure Dartmouth, 95% of their incoming class is top 10% in their high school class. So if you look at that stat, whether I'm off by 1% or 2%, somewhere around there, the idea is that 5% of kids are not in the top 10%. That's your athletes, pretty much, right? So recognize that if you're top 25% and are applying to school that takes a certain number from the top whatever percent of their class, just have a general sense of where you are, because this can make something that you feel like you have the GPA, but the relevance of class rank, again, you guys don't have formal class rank, but you, in talking to the College Center, getting a general sense of where you fall helps you understand like how realistic is it? Because if a bunch of other kids from your high school are applying with way higher GPAs, higher course rigor, all of these things, it's going to make a difference. Now, when you're picking these, when you're younger, so as a senior, you're obviously in the throes of this. I know a lot of you are seniors here. This is something that you want. The list we always recommend that you end up with is 8 to 12 colleges. Most people end up with closer to 12 to 15. I think part of it is it depends on how much you're in love with the safety, right? So if you are overqualified for Oregon, but you love Oregon and you're like, I would be so happy there, you probably don't need more, right? You're probably okay with one school as a safety, maybe put a second one on just to hedge your bets, but you don't need multiple. But if you've never visited any of your safeties and you don't know if you'd be happy there, you may want more safeties. And the higher you're shooting for the type of schools, so if you are putting a bunch of Ivies and other top 10 schools and MIT and Northwestern and UChicago and all these types of schools, then you're probably going to have a slightly larger list, because when you realize most of your schools have a lower than 10% acceptance rate, you're going to need more options to get the results you probably want. So when you're building the list as a senior, like I said, if you're 8 to 12, I think that's a very good number. That means somewhere between probably 1 and 3 safeties, right? And then you're going to have a bunch of reaches generally, and maybe some super reaches in there. And then the rest should be targets. You want enough targets. Look, everyone's most excited about the safety, or sorry, about the reaches and the super reaches. That's just the reality of this process. But if you can find some targets that are good fits that you're going to enjoy, you're going to feel a lot better. So find schools where you are what they want, which you should want to find anyways. So don't try to, stretch yourself so thin to try to force something that, look, we love kids applying to the top schools, and a lot of kids are very, very happy there. We've also seen a lot of kids who barely got in and struggled so much and were miserable and did horribly because they weren't really cut out to be there. So it's not to say don't apply and don't shoot high, but I just want you thinking about those targets, the schools that would be excited to have you because everyone there is like you. This is also an aggressive form of the question, but I also oftentimes ask students, do you want to be the smart kid in the dumb row or the dumb kid in the smart row? This is also something where I have kids and a lot are like, can I just find a row that has a lot of people like me? That'd be great. But if you have an extreme response, you might feel more towards safeties or towards reaches based on, how much you want to be challenged or how confident you want to be that you can be at the top of your class. One factor that changes a lot of these kind of statistics and likelihoods of schools working out is whether you're doing any of these early options. And colleges don't make this easy. The names and the terminology are awkward. So I use this slide shows up in a lot of different presentations, but let's just go over this. Early action, you're applying early, usually early November. You get a notification somewhere between December and January. You still have till May 1st to decide for what it's worth. It's not binding. It's a good choice for college or for applicants whose applications are already as strong as they can be. So your grades have always been great. They're rock solid. Your test scores are done. Your essays are going to be awesome. Your activities are well-rounded and already kind of formed. Again, it shows strong interest, shows you're on top of things and organized, but it's not binding. So you can ultimately, you have till May 1st to decide. You can see where else you get in and make another decision. Because of this doesn't statistically impact the likelihood of getting in very much. Some schools it's marginal. And I would say when in doubt, if your application is already awesome and it's going to be as good as it will be, apply early action. You're going to have a good shot at that. So any kid that I have who is already a really solid applicant, we look through all of the schools and we go through and say, look, these 6 schools offer early action. Let's get those applications in by November 1st. And then we'll hear by December or January. Usually you get at least a couple before the holidays and you can kind of breathe easy and say, I'm going to college. And then we wait for the big boys to come out in the spring. Restrictive or single choice early action. This is the one that drives me nuts because it's the most confusing. So this is some terminology that you may or may not have heard. It's a process in which you are applying early, still not obligated to attend if admitted, but there's restriction on where else you can apply early. So rules vary between schools. So read each school's specific policies. But here's the issue. Some schools call it, like Yale, I think calls it single choice. Right? I think Notre Dame might call it restrictive early action. Every school that uses it, Stanford has their own terminology, but like Georgetown just calls it early action. But if you read the fine print, it says that you cannot apply anywhere else that's a binding school. So you could not do, which we're about to talk about, you cannot do early decision anywhere else. So it's limiting that. There are other schools that are restrictive early action that says you cannot apply early action, the non-binding option, anywhere else either. So you're showing them preference. But the reality is you're not getting a statistical bump really for it. It's still restrictive or single choice early action. Again, it's better than early action. It's a little bit more, they're taking you a little more seriously because you've eliminated other options to prove your interest, but it's nowhere near as effective if a school offers that as another school that offers early decision. For what it's worth, there's no other school, there's no school that offers restrictive or single choice early action and early decision. It's going to be one or the other. You might find a school that offers regular early action and early decision. That's possible, but it doesn't always work out that way. There's plenty of schools that only have early action or early decision. Now, early decision completely changes your stats and your likelihood when we're talking about a balanced list of what's a safety, what's a target, what's a reach. This is where you apply early. It's usually November 1st, sometimes November 15th, and you agree to attend if they accept you. This is a binding agreement. You sign, your parents sign the contract, you sign it, your high school counselor signs it. It should only be used if the student is confident in their school choice and financial situation. So the one exception to this is that, so if your financial situation changes, you can break up this binding agreement because you can prove, look, I applied saying I needed this much money. Now I need a lot more because my dad was laid off. And if they can't match that and honor what you need, they will let you out of the agreement. But if your financial situation doesn't change and you just decide that you're not happy with the package they give you, then you've got a problem. Schools have a financial aid calculator, for what it's worth, on their application or on their websites. So you could plug in some of your numbers for your income and savings and see what they're considering and see what they expect to give you. And then if you have more questions, you can always reach out to the university, but you should have a general sense of what they're going to give you before you apply. So early decision statistically, this is, it's a huge difference. So if you, I'll always use Northwestern because I know those stats well. So this last year, they had the regular decision was, I think it was around 6% acceptance rate. Might have been 5 point something, but it was around 6% for regular decision. It's almost 25% early decision. So it's an immense difference. It's huge, right? And the idea here is that, and again, I love my alma mater and I think they're amazing, but they also recognize that if you did regular decision to Northwestern, you probably applied to a Stanford, Harvard, Yale type of school. And they realize that if you get into one of those, you're probably going to go. So sometimes they're more apprehensive to give a great kid a spot if they feel like they're not actually a top choice. And this is, by the way, sometimes you hear of kids who don't get into a school that everyone expected them to get into. This is oftentimes why, that they're like, well, we assumed he'd go elsewhere because he was too qualified or overqualified. But if you do early decision and you give them that binding commitment that you will attend, if they are, if they accept you, you're saying, I'm coming, you're my number one choice, you can get in. Now, if you're not qualified, that's not going to suddenly make you qualified. But if you are qualified, then you have much higher likelihood at the vast majority of schools that offer early decision. There are some, I think Brown's one of them, where it's like a 1 or 2% difference. But candidly, it's the schools that are not Ivies. UChicago, it's an enormous difference. Duke, it's a huge difference, right? Those types of schools they're amazing schools and sometimes even top 10, but recognize that there's still other schools that somebody might prefer. It's a little bit of a chip on the shoulder approach, but that's how it works. So know that ED can change the game. So something in relation to building your list, if there's a school, some kids will ask me, is Tulane a safety, target, or reach? And I was like, well, if you do early decision, it's a target, right? Like you're 50-50. I think you're pretty much what they're looking for. If you do regular decision, it's a reach. It's a huge reach because Tulane doesn't pull that many kids from regular decision anymore. So they pull most of their class from early decision 1, or we'll talk about in a second, early decision 2, and they also have early action. So they're trying to pull their class early. Another thing that's worth noting to understand this entire kind of approach is that colleges have their rankings. When you think of US News and World Report and Forbes and all those things, a big chunk of their ranking is based on their yield. And their yield is based on how many people that they accepted them back, right? So if they offer you a spot and you say, no, thanks, I'm going to go over here, it can hurt them and damage kind of the value of their reputation and education, right? So they would rather the kid who's a guarantee, because 100% of their early decision kids said yes when they offered them a spot. So it makes a big difference for you, and it can change where a school falls on your list. So early decision 2, this is the same deadline as the regular decision deadline. Usually it's usually January, early January. And similar to early decision, it's also binding, right? If you're accepted, you still have to go. But what sometimes happens, let's say you apply to Northwestern early decision and you don't get in. UChicago, you still love the Windy City, you want to go there. UChicago offers early decision 2. So you could then put an application into UChicago as early decision 2. You will find out by February generally, and that you will know if you get in and it's binding, and then you pull all your other applications. But this also gives you an edge. It gives you that same kind of boost compared to applying regular decision. So in orders, a lot of people ask me to rank these in order of like strategy and how much impact it has on the likelihood of getting in. Early decision, by far the best. Early decision 2, second best. Restrictive or single choice early action, next best. Early action, next best. And regular decision, worst. So this is the other reason, just to kind of put things in context for why you want to apply early whenever possible. Again, if you're qualified, if your grades slip junior year, you need time to bring them up senior year to show colleges that that was a fluke and you're doing fine. But if you're applying, to any of these early action or early decision schools. So side note, testing. This is one thing that I've had a lot of seniors who've reached out and said that they are debating testing. A lot of schools, you can check school by school. A lot of them are going to tell you that you can test up until December. You can still apply early action and then rush your scores if you take an October date, but don't get your scores until after November 1st. You've already submitted your application, but you can rush your scores to them. That is always an option if you think it's going to improve your score or your chances. But yeah, so just be aware that testing, you should be done. If you're younger, try to be done before senior year. I like when kids are done with testing by the end of junior year. It frees you up and keeps you sane. But if you're not there, it's totally fine. But do be aware that you can rush scores after the deadline to some schools, but you want to check and see which schools are going to allow you to do that. Okay, so when you're building your list, when you're younger, let's talk about the younger kids for a second. We focused on seniors a little bit here. If you're a freshman or a sophomore, the first thing you need to be doing is figuring out what you even want. So don't stress about this. This should be the fun part. This is where you get to go judge colleges, not the other way around. Go visit, see anything. I always say visit every school in LA or Southern California for that matter, and see what you like. Do you like big or small, urban, rural, right? What do you like? Then start to kind of build your list from there. Then junior year and early senior year is when you start to decide if you want to ED somewhere. This is what's going to make your chances better at these more competitive schools. But I understand why people don't want it. A lot of kids want to have options and they want to be able to go into spring saying, I have 5 choices. I'm picking my best school or my favorite school from that. You lose that with ED, but you're more likely to get into your top choices. So the sooner you start kind of touring and exploring colleges, it will help you if you are looking at schools that have ED. But if you find your dream school doesn't even offer it, then so be it. Go for your dream school. And you might lose that opportunity at another school for ED, but you don't want it anyways. You want to go where your heart is. So that is kind of the basics. So again, building the list, you want to make sure that you're taking into account the GPA, the test scores, the extracurriculars. Again, the smaller schools care more about who you are, what you bring to the table in the community. But this stuff right here, which deadline you hit, makes a big difference. And Tulane is honestly a perfect example of that. If you look at their acceptance rates for early decision compared to and they have early action and early decision too, and regular decision, it's an immense difference. And plenty of schools are that way. So keep that in mind. And that is it. I know this was kind of short, but that's kind of when you're building your list, it's keeping your options open and making sure that you kind of understand what's going to impact your change or your chances at all these schools and what won't. But Gabby, questions, what do we have?
Yes. A handful of questions. So the first is test scores. Whether or not to submit test scores in a test optional school, how do you decide? Are you going by the median score of accepted students? Is anything above that you submit, anything below you don't, kind of the rule of thumb? How do you handle that?
It's a great question. Generally, that is part of it. So, most schools will publish the 25th to 75th percentile. So you'll be able to see this range. So that means whatever that range they give you is 25% lower, 25% higher. If you fall on the higher end of that range they give you or above it, you're submitting. If you're on the lower end of the range they give you, to me, what matters then is your GPA. Because if you are way above their average GPA, but you're on the low end of their test score range, I wouldn't submit, right? But if you are somebody who has not such great GPAs, but you're still kind of in the range for test scores, you probably want to submit test scores and balance that out. Hopefully that answers that.
Yeah, thank you. One other big picture question. So what is the right number of colleges to apply to? How are you determining what number of safety, what number of target, and what number of reach is right for you?
Yeah, so I think we touched on this a little bit, but the idea is kind of, to me, how much you truly love and would be happy at your safeties. So if you have, and safety versus likely, again, slightly different, but if you have a safety where we're like, look, hell froze over if you didn't get in here and you love it, you don't need to have 4 other safeties. We're pretty confident. And by the way, there are a lot of schools that kids consider safeties that get back to you a few weeks later. So there are schools that you'll apply to in September, you'll know by October 1st. And that's great because then if you got in, you can say, I'm done, I don't need any more safeties. But the schools that are going to drag it out, and if you haven't visited your safeties and you're going off hearsay and what you think you like, I usually recommend kids have 3, sometimes 4. I wouldn't go lower than 3 if you haven't visited and don't know you actually like the schools, because you might get into all of them, but you might only like one of them. So that's it for safeties. Now for reaches, here's the reality, it's how many can you do well? When you're applying, the number of essays, the amount of work that goes into this. I have a lot of kids that candidly just want to throw darts at a wall, and counselors often call it just a prestige list where they've got the top 10 schools, they've got all the Ivies, they've got, these big boys on the list. That's fine. If you're a top student, try that, but recognize that you're probably not a great fit at Columbia and Brown and Dartmouth and Stanford. Like, they're looking for different things. So if that's your list, just be cautious, because you're putting a lot of effort into a lot of applications that you may not actually be the perfect fit for, and vice versa. So I recommend with reaches, that you just consider how much effort you're willing to put in. Because if you look, and by the way, just an example is like Princeton, they have a lot of essays. MIT is not even on the Common App. They have a lot of essays. Harvard has one, right? So how prestigious or difficult a reach school is not actually the question. It's more about how many essays and how much is that taking away from other schools. So an example was, I use Stanford with kids. Look, if you're super qualified and you're a legacy or you cured cancer over the summer, great. We can apply early. We can apply, as a primary school. But what I generally recommend for the kids who are kind of like, let's just see, I want to see if I can get into Stanford. So I'd recommend that let's apply to all the other schools on your list. And if you have the time, energy, and desire still to work on Stanford, we can do all those essays later, right? And at the end, and you'll still have plenty of time, but then you can kind of decide how much you still really want it. But the number of reaches really does depend on your ability to turn out amazing essays. And it's draft after draft after draft for these essays. And if you're younger, not to terrify you, but this is something so many kids who are seniors just don't put the effort in, or don't realize they're going to have to. And then it becomes crunch time. So make sure that you're giving yourself time and you're giving yourself the option of turning out really great applications. That's more important than applying to 20 schools. And then targets to me fall to somewhere in the middle, where you want a few of them. And you might end up, some kids that I work with only have 1 or 2 safeties and only a couple true reaches and a lot of targets in the middle, because they want to have a lot of options. They want schools that are competitive, but not crazy. And they're going to have a bigger list in the middle. So I think it depends on, again, where you want to be in that smart kid, dumb row, dumb kid, smart row, and your relative to everybody else.
Awesome. Thank you. So for those families who are eagerly awaiting access to Naviance, what would you say are the #1 resources for looking at college options now?
Get that. So back to this lovely thing. So I kind of skipped over the middle one. So the Fisk Guide to Colleges, it's a book. You can get it on Amazon. It's usually like 20 bucks. I love this book. It's one of the only books that I think is not absolutely painful to read. There are a lot of these that are just data and aggressive facts. This has all of that, but it also gives you descriptions of kind of the college town and what the vibe on campus is like. The other thing, if you want to get kind of serious about things, you can do common data sets. So if you Google common data set Northwestern, common data set Stanford, common data set Colorado State, you can see a lot of information about who they're accepting and how things are breaking down. That's an option. There's also 2 websites that I like to send our students to that are just kind of ones, they're both more fun than anything, but they're still useful. One of them is Niche, Niche, and there's a lot of kids reviewing their schools. But I always say, keep in mind, this is like Yelp. The people who decide to write reviews are either really happy or really ticked off. So you're going to hear some extremes on both sides there, but it still gives you a sense of kind of the themes and looking for, what people are saying about these schools. Then another one is Campus Reel, CAMPUSREEL. Campus Reel is, think of as TikTok for colleges. It's videos, it's that people are taking you on tours of their dorms and showing you around. And again, that's more for fun, but it still gives you a sense of schools. And also, all colleges, thanks to COVID, now have virtual info sessions and tours. So if you are interested in a school that's in, Pittsburgh, and you're like, I'm interested in Carnegie Mellon, but I don't want to go to Pittsburgh right now, then great, do the tour online, right? See what you can find out. One pro tip on this is the kid should use their email address to sign up, because then, and make sure it's the same email address you're going to use as a senior for your applications, because they're tracking if you've been around, have you signed up for things? Are you showing interest? Are you doing your homework? And if your mom signs up, they don't necessarily know that you got any of this information. And do also keep in mind, if you're younger, this is a great way to demonstrate interest, but it also means if they're sending you emails now, most schools, I think it's over 80% now, are tracking whether you open the emails and whether you're clicking on links. So if you sign up and never do anything with it, that's almost worse. So I generally recommend to students, look, sign up for this stuff, create folders for each college, right? And if Michigan's on your list and you're like, I'm pretty sure I'm going to want to apply there, file away any email that's relevant to you. Because when you have to write a why Michigan essay in 3 years or 1 month, depending on how old you are, you will have all this information now that you can pull from. And you can say, oh, they talked about this new building for biomedical engineering, or they talked about their architecture program, hired this amazing professor. And now you have more information at your fingertips than just Googling or looking on their website like everyone else. So that's another good way to get a lot of information.
Fabulous. So this, barring any last second submissions, is our last question. Testing schedules. So when is the ideal time to start that process? When is it sort of too late to consider testing? What does all of that look like?
Yeah, so I'll kind of answer this thing. Gabby, can you check the schedule? I think there's a to test or not to test webinar. I'd love to know when that is. I think it's later on. So if you're younger, it'll be helpful. If you're senior, it's not going to help much. But what I generally recommend is once you're done with Algebra 2, you should start testing. This is something where you're going to get too far behind. So I have kids who took Algebra 2 as a freshman and then wait to test until the end of junior year. They don't remember anything. Everything that they needed was from 7th and 8th and 9th grade. And so you're too far past the math that's on the test. Grammar, you don't learn, let's be honest. You either learned grammar earlier or you didn't, and you're going to need to review it or you won't. And reading skills, candidly, the reading skills you learn in English class in high school are not the reading skills you need for testing. So the number one kind of determining factor is where you are in math. Now, if you're taking, let's say you're taking Algebra 2 as a junior, a lot of people are like, should I wait then until senior year to test? What we generally recommend is if you're going to do any prep, you want to start second semester junior year because you still need to review all the other math, all the other grammar, every grammar rule in the English language. So you could start prepping in January or February, start kind of refreshing on all those other things, continuing to learn Algebra 2, and then you're officially ready to start taking tests, like official tests, as of May, June, July, August. But it does depend. And it also, by the way, depends on what scores you're looking for. We have kids who are taking Algebra 2 as a junior who can start earlier because especially ACT, like there's not that much from Algebra 2. So if you're looking to be in the mid to high 20s, you can do that without having all of Algebra 2 under your belt. But if you're looking to be in the mid 30s, then you definitely need to try to get that fully covered.
Awesome. And for those of you who are interested in knowing a little bit more about to test or not to test, we are hosting that webinar on Tuesday, October 18th.
There you go. So we'll go into a little bit more of that and like which tests and why and which schools and, the test optional, test blind and test required landscape and kind of what's changing and trends we're expecting, but also the changes in the SAT that are coming up. So if you're a freshman or sophomore, we'll discuss how that will affect you also. Any other questions, Gabby? Is that it?
We have one last question sort of on this topic. How many times should someone plan to test?
Awesome question too. I would tell you 2 to 3 times. This is generally what we recommend, because if you take it once, unless you got a perfect score, you can probably do a little better. So, and a lot of colleges let you super score. So you could take math from, March and your verbal from May or whatever it is, and they let you mix and match. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But if you start taking it 4 or 5 times, A, you start to look slightly neurotic, and B, it kind of negates whatever progress you've made. One thing that people ask a lot is, can colleges see all of your scores? It depends on a lot of factors. So it depends on whether you're taking SAT or ACT, and it depends on where you're applying. So different colleges have different relationships with the testing companies. It's leaning towards, like, if you're younger, my guess is that by the time you get to this point, they won't be able to see how many times you've tested. It'll probably be just whatever you want to submit, since we're moving more towards test optional. But there are some schools, even last year with everyone being test optional, that still automatically sucked up every single test score from College Board from a kid who took the SAT. It just depends on the school. So the way we generally approach it is take it as many times as you need to if you're actually putting effort in to an extent. Like if you're prepping, if you're putting focus in, but if you're just taking it again to see if it works, that's probably going to backfire. And yeah, make sure you're ready. Don't take it for the first time if you're not scoring where you kind of want to be. It's not going to magically happen generally if it's not happening on practice tests.
Awesome. So barring any just under the wire submissions, I think that's it. So
All
thank
right,
you
guys.
so much, Jen, and thank all of you for joining us.
Yes, we got plenty more of these. Join us for the rest and let us know if you have any other questions or concerns. But yeah, have a good night and we'll see you at future webinars.